What is up, everybody? It is Alex from Heavy New York calling from the quarantine zone again, and this time we got Billy Sherwood of the brand new project Arc of Life. Thank you so much for your time today to talk about this brand new project.
Hey man, thanks for having me on the show. Appreciate it.
Yeah, we appreciate your time. So, being that this is, like kind of like a new beginning, like this is almost like a new project with the self-titled release of Arc of Life, you just want to talk about like how the making of this was in terms of like the recording, the songwriting, and how the idea of this sort of came to light?
Sure. Basically, it started with songwriting in a bus on the 2017 Yes Tour. John and I shared a bus, and I had my recording studio in the back, and we recorded about 3 or 4 songs and started kind of realizing that we might be hearing something and looking at taking this to another level and forming a band. So we sort of reached out to Jay Shellen, who is also, additional drummer with Yes, and also played with me in Conspiracy and Circa and some other bands on my solo stuff. He jumped in, and then guitar player Jimmy Hahn jumped in, who was in my band Logic originally, my first band, and was also in Conspiracy and Circa with us. And then Dave Kersner on keyboards, who's got his own solo career, and he's also in a band called Sound of Contact. And he and I have been talking about doing a project together of some sort forever, and so this seemed like the right one. And with that, we had the band, and it took about from 2017 until about 2019, really, to finish the record and get it all done, and get all the overdubs in and have everybody involved.
It sounds like that this album is almost kind of like a retrospective of all the different projects you were involved in. Like, a lot of people think it is. Like, I've heard some people say it is almost kind of like, Yes's stepchild or, half-brother or something like that. But it almost seems like this is a retrospective of Yes and Conspiracy and all the projects you're involved in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's got more to do with I sort of have a tight-knit group of friends. We kind of hang out too much.
Yeah. Well, it sounded like also it was a very organic process. It didn't seem like you were revolving too much around like a preconceived idea or anything like that. It just seemed like everything sort of fell into place with it, right?
Yeah, exactly, and that's really, it is exactly how it happened. It was very natural, and we kind of knew who we wanted. We made a call, and they went, "Yeah, that sounds cool." So it just worked out naturally that way.
Was there at all, though, with the making of this, if you don't mind me asking, being that, this does have a lot of the projects that you were involved in, in this current lineup, was there maybe kind of like, I don't know, for lack of better words, pressure? Were you trying to make this a very distinguished sound from Yes in a way, or were you not even thinking about that?
Wasn't really thinking about it, just sort of being creative. John and I having fun in the back of the bus singing and coming up with different progressions and just enjoying that process. And I think the DNA of Yes comes through us by proxy, but we weren't really thinking this is going to be for Yes, and then realizing, oh wait, let's take a turn and go another direction. We were just working on material for the fun of it, and it just sort of naturally came through and started developing took on its own life, so to speak.
Isn't it always great when like it just happens and you're not revolving too much around a preconceived idea or a superficial goal or even having a deadline over your head? It's always great when it just happens and that's the end of it.
Yeah, I mean that kind of story goes back to one of my second band, World Trade, which Bruce Gowdy and I were partners in, and we wrote 4 songs with the intent to go get a publishing deal and just make a couple of bucks. And we ended up with one of the biggest record deals of that year and put out the World Trade album. So I think the naturalness, it comes and reflects in the music and makes it more powerful as well.
Mm-hmm. With being such a prolific artist between Yes and Conspiracy and with Circa and all in your solo work and all that, is there a different mind frame depending on the projects you're with, or is there a usual maybe method behind the madness that applies to everything?
There seems to be a feeling and a tone that's set for each project, and it's hard to to pin it, but it's like a je ne sais quoi. It's just each project's got its own little feel and unique design to it, and you kind of know how to angle into writing with it. You know what I mean? I know when I hear something that I'm starting that might be like, wow, this is good for Circa, or this is good for that. But when you're starting something new, that concept isn't there, and you're just looking to create a new sound, even for yourself. John and I, we selfishly we wanted to like it first. You know what I mean? And then see what anyone else thought about it. So it kind of comes about like that. Just setting the tone for each project has its own sort of palette, if you will.
Mm-hmm. And I've noticed with this Arc of Life album, I feel like there was many different vibes throughout it. Being, going from Life Has a Way to a track like Until Further Notice to Just in Sight to ending with The End Game. Do you almost consider like each song like a representation of like an emotion that you and John and Jay were like everybody else were feeling at that particular time? Is it kind of like a retrospective in that?
Yeah, I mean, there's lyrically, there's some things tied into personal stuff, on the record that happened. I mean, in a goofy way, the song Talking with Siri came out of, I was on tour with Yes and somewhere over in the UK and, enjoyed hospitality at the gig and came back to my hotel room and asked Siri to set my alarm for 7:30 a.m. or something like that. And she said, your alarm is set. I said, well, thank you. And she said, you're welcome. And I started bantering, in a funny way back and forth with this AI and asked it, do you dream? And she said, only electric sheep, but only sometimes, which is a quote from a Vonnegut book. And then I said, do you love? And she said, who, me? And at that moment, it kind of triggered this whole song came to me.
Did you, when talking to Siri, did you have yet to say, I see a silhouette of a man? Because she'll recite the entire lyrics of Bohemian Rhapsody.
Yeah, I know that one too. I didn't know about the Vonnegut one. That one came as a surprise. So when I was like, what? But that those personal accounts come into play in some of the lyrics for sure. I mean, they're reflected all over it. But generally speaking, there's a sort of positive feeling to everything, and we wanted to bring that across too.
Yeah. Well, I've heard a lot of artists, denounce, the development of technology and artificial intelligence, but think about how much great subject matter it created for all music out there, right?
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, I love it. It's the future. That's where we're going. It's droids and Star Wars. Let's go. Where do I sign up?
Yeah, and that's really good, especially coming from an artist who's been around for a long time and has witnessed the world change so much. It's really cool how like you're able to kind of like adapt to the world around you and almost let that just be an inspiration, not like trying to just rely on the old days or bring this back or stick with this. It's really cool how the world changes and you evolve with the world in which we see in your art.
Yeah, adapt and overcome, as they say. It's interesting that, as you say that, it got me thinking, because I was of an age when I started engineering and producing where analog was transitioning to digital. And I went with that curve, and I saw that whole curve happen and landed in the digital domain 100% and just never looked back. But there are people who, are analog diehards, and they want to do it old school, and I respect that, but I'm much happier on the cutting edge.
Yeah, to each his own. And I think that keeps it diverse and that, gives us more stuff to notice in music as well.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I've always thought that with every project that you are involved with too, like, I mean, even Yes is like, I know artists are kind of like, feel differently about this term, but I feel like your music has always been relatively experimental. So trying new things is almost like just part of the creative process for you for all time, right?
Yeah, and I think that my biggest ally in that regard is that I get to hang a big flag up in terms of the genre that I live in called progressive rock, which by its very nature means to progress. So, and experiment and be able to do crazy things. And I've always enjoyed that genre, and that's where all that to me lives. And, when we look back now at the inspirations for it, you've got Gentle Giant and Genesis and Pink Floyd and all these amazing bands, Yes and Rush, and pushing those envelopes. It's for me, that's what it's all about. And I not only try to do that in the songwriting, but also in the playing and the composition, and then one more step in the engineering part of it and getting the sound of the thing to feel like a vibe coming out of the speaker. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And do you feel that also being like a collaborative artist as well? Like, I mean, you've collaborated with a variety of different, like you've done a collaboration with Rat, you've done a collaboration with Motorhead, you've done a collaboration with Fear Factory and John 5 and like various artists. Like, do you almost feel like that opens your mind to brand new discoveries and new ideas to incorporate in your own work as well?
Without a doubt. I mean, one of the things that I benefited most from doing these kinds of tribute records that I got into, a particular, I produced Paul Rogers' record in '93 that was called Muddy Water Blues, tribute to Muddy Waters, and it had Beck and Gilmore and Slash, all these great guys. And it was really kind of at the leading edge of tribute records. There weren't really a ton of them at that point. And it got great notoriety. And after that, I started getting offers to do many of those. And the one thing that was the most beneficial was being able to look over the shoulder of basically all my heroes in rock and roll and prog and see their techniques and how they play. And, oh, my God, look at how he holds his pick. Or, oh, wow, I wouldn't have thought to overdub that on top of that. And so I picked up many, many tricks from a lot of these guys over the years, and also with great engineers as well, looking over those shoulders. So if you're not learning constantly, then you're not really evolving,
Absolutely. And I think you're always learning whether you realize it or not. It's like a subconscious thing. You learn whether you realize it or not.
Yeah. And it's good to keep expanding like that,
Mm-hmm. And kind of going back to what you said about like progressive rock, because I have so many discussions with progressive. Like I interviewed Fates Warning at the tail end of last year, and we had like a discussion on that, on like prog and all this. Because like at first I thought progressive music was just music with 27.5-minute long songs, but then I saw bands with 3-minute long songs being labeled as prog. I was like, okay, so song length has nothing to do with it. To you, what makes is progressive music something that evolves in song structure? Is it a concept? Is it a style just in itself? What makes something progressive to you?
I think if it's interesting in the way that you go about each particular instrument, and then they make up the whole of the picture as a result, that's part of it. And I think for the for maybe the ear that's not as able to dissect things, just feels the music happening, they feel the whole. They feel the whole song coming at them. But other people can actually tune into just what the bass player is doing, or what is that guitar part, or what is that. So I think the most important thing is that the whole is feeling good. But while you're doing that, if you can make each instrument as interesting as hell, then by all means do it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I look at it. And in a 3-minute song, like for instance, You Make It Real from the Ark record is a very simple little song, except the chord progression is kind of unusual. And the bass line is kind of composed in a way that it's moving around quite a bit and doing things. And the melodies. And so I think when you apply those kind of rules to how you're creating your song, as opposed to, we're playing a G, everybody's playing a G, and just pump a G. You know what I mean? That's what makes it different and takes it into that experimental lane.
Mm-hmm. I've always thought that a progressive music is like, it doesn't rely too much on structure like verse, chorus. It is more like a song that demonstrates a lot of evolution as it moves along.
Yes, and it doesn't really have any boundaries in how you need to form the songs in terms of their shape and their structure. But by the same token, for me, sometimes the value of a simple structured song enables the listener to tune into it easier, and then the trick is to make it proggy underneath that bed, you know what I mean? Which is where you get simplicity mixed with some complexity, Yeah,
I've always said that prog is as much of an adjective as it is like as a noun in a way, bringing my English nerd into that. So I think it could go either way. You could be a progressive band, or you could be another type of band with progressive tendencies.
Yeah, I mean, and there are things that have been classified like rock that I think in my iPod they're labeled prog, which, for instance, Pink Floyd. I mean, to me, they're a prog band. That stuff's totally experimental. But people will label things the way they are. Most times, as you said earlier, the people label prog based on song lengths, and or the fact that you're playing in 7 and 5 and 11 and these weird time signatures. I kind of try to take all that stuff and throw it into a thinking where you could do something simple, but then bring those rules into play within that simplicity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and being a bassist too, because I've always said that bass players. I mean, it's rock and roll. We've all heard those bass player jokes here and there, but bass has such an emphasis on both rhythm and melody as well. So when you are like in songwriting mode, does it always help to have other music to write your bass parts according to, or do you sometimes have a whole pattern written down and the band would write over that?
Usually I'm composing and listening to the track without the bass and hearing the chords and how the melody is working, and then thinking about how much do I need to hover around a root note here, or how much can I get away with sort of having something moving around that implies the third or the fifth of the chord and gives it a different spin. So and I got all that kind of thinking from Squire and Paul McCartney and those guys who have those bass lines that are just incredibly composed. And so I kind of come at it from a composition point and then put the groove into the factor.
Mm-hmm.
It's got a groove, but what it's grooving on melodically in your playing, is those two worlds can meet. And, I mean, there's plenty of bands that if you were to play an E chord, they just say, just play E and pump the E. But there's a lot more you can do with that than that. And I try to look for the most creative and musically harmonious with the song type of part,
Yeah, I mean, and just watching a bass player live when they're so into it, there's so much stuff that has evolved with it. Like, there's a death metal band I listen to called Archspire, and their bass player is like doing hammer-ons on a 6-string bass without a headstock, and like playing it as if it was a guitar and playing along with the melody. I mean, it just seems like the bass has so much, like it's needed in just about every genre, but there's so much that has evolved with it.
Yeah, and there's so many great bass players. I mean, Jaco Pastorius is one of the greatest, and Tony Levin, and how Tony applies his bass playing to Peter Gabriel, and Chris with Yes, and Geddy, and I mean, so there's it's a powerhouse part of the band, which is what I always dug. I mean, I started playing as I started, I was a drummer, and that's what I did mostly growing up, and then I converted into bass and I picked up guitar and keys from there. But the engine room of a band is the drummer and the bass player, and that's where I always like to be, either in one chair or the other,
Yeah, well, famous saying, if your drummer or bass player sucks, then your whole band sucks.
It's very true.
Yep. And I have 2 more questions for you, but in order to get inspired to write, when you come up with these new ideas, whether it's with Yes or Arc of Life or even working with another artist, does inspiration come out of nowhere sometimes, or do you almost prefer to be in a certain element or have to be in a certain place in order for the ideas to flow through?
No, they come in the strangest ways and at the strangest times. I could be driving down the street listening to the radio and hearing something on the news that triggers an entire thought process, and I'll shut the radio off and just compose sort of a poem onto my phone while I'm driving. Or I'll be at home just kicking around the house, and I'll start hearing a melody in my head and go into the studio and tinker around with that, or I might sing something in the car and start there. So it comes from the weirdest places, but I tend to watch a lot of media stuff, and I'm pretty up to date on what's going on in the world and all those kinds of things. So I draw inspiration from a lot of what happens in the world as well.
Yeah, well, there's no better time to be inspired than now, right?
Yeah, goodness gracious, yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, and I'd imagine, too, that inspiration sometimes strikes at very inconvenient times as well, right?
Well, it does if you don't have access to record the idea somehow, but I've managed to now circumvent that problem and I always have my phone with my recorder on, so I capture any idea that comes at me. I jot it down immediately, because I've had that feeling once or twice where it's like, damn, what was that? I remember it was cool, but I can't remember it.
Yeah. Well, what do you think of this idea? I've been pitching this to a couple of artists because every artist has told me who I've asked this question, they always feel inspired when they're in the shower. So, like, what if we start making, like, amplifiers and studio equipment that is actually waterproof where you could record it in the shower?
Right. I suppose, you could, if you had some little mini recording studio with a little built-in microphone you could just put on the shelf, hit record and go.
Imagine pitching that at the NAMM show. Like, you have like a waterproof studio and they're just like fire extinguishing it the whole time just to show how waterproof it is.
It's like an Impractical Jokers challenge.
Oh, I love that show. I love that show. I live in New York City, and I live really close to Union Square, and I'm always hoping that I run into those guys.
Well, I watch that show, and I look at what's going on with New York buzzing behind him, and I'm like, wow, where does that go on,
Oh, those guys are New York City as humans. Like,
yeah. I know, and all the life going on around them, the buzz, it's like, we need that back.
yeah, and the best is when they troll at concerts, like when they did their Steel Panther fiasco, and when they played at the Imagine Dragons concert and got booed.
Yeah, I know, that was great.
Yeah.
Classic.
Yeah, some of those inventions that they pitched, though, are some good ideas, I gotta say.
Yeah.
And the final question I wanted to ask you is the most difficult question of the whole interview. Are you ready?
I am ready.
All right. And I feel like you, of all people I've asked this to, are the best person to ask this. How do you know when a song is done?
I'm pretty good at that, because I learned in my youth that you can overcook the pasta and it's horrible at the end of the day. So you kind of want to walk away from something after there's still some air in the track left, and it's there's still some other light and shade that you didn't cover up with overdubs. There's nothing worse than too many overdubs that just kill stuff. So there's a beauty in a simplicity that has to be maintained, even though things get complex. It's hard to define, but I know it when I can hear it, and it's a fine line, but you find the end there.
I've never expected a member of Yes to tell me that simplicity is part of their formula. Just saying.
Well, in the midst of all that chaos, sometimes when you break it down to just an acoustic guitar and a vocal, that speaks volumes, you know what I mean? And that's exactly what you need right there. And then kick it back in, it's like a very orchestral sort of approach, but that's another part of what I think prog allows us to create in, is that world of sort of an orchestral sort of thought put to this rock and rollness of all this,
Yeah. Well, I think the beauty of just your entire catalog, and I'm excited for people to hear The Arc of Life, because I think it's going to really get a new generation into progressive music as well. What I love about just your catalog is that I don't know what to expect from you. I really don't. Like, if you look at your entire, resume, it's like, really? And it just keeps going. So that's what I've always liked about your art in general. I never know what to expect. And, there's artists who have formulas that work for them. Like, AC/DC doesn't need to, change too much. I think it's always going to be good. But I think for you, just bringing something new to the table every time is always going to work in your favor.
Yeah. Well, it comes out of the love and the passion to want to work and do things. You know what I mean? And working with other people in genres that might be not necessarily a comfort zone, but dive in and go for it. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
I mean, in 1 year I went from Paul Rogers to Motorhead to Air Supply. I mean, that's a pretty wide chasm in there.
You got to really shock people now and collaborate with like I know that you collaborated with Fear Factory. I believe you worked on their Digimortal album. Now you need to go heavier. Like, do a collaboration with Morbid Angel or Cannibal Corpse.
Right, exactly, man. You never know. Stranger things have happened. So
that is true. That is true.
Put in the good word. You probably know those guys.
Yeah. I have yet to interview Cannibal Corpse, but I'll put in a good word to the Morbid Angel guys.
All I mean, the John 5 record is kind of in that lane, but not quite as intense, but in that lane, that's for sure.
Yeah, some of the death metal I hear makes John 5 sound like ABBA, so...
Right, you never know.
Yeah. So before we go... Well, actually, now that we mention it, though, progressive music and death metal have been working together very, very well. Like, I don't know if you heard of the band Obscura or Blood Incantation, but if you want to hear prog mixed with death metal, I think you would appreciate that.
Oh, cool. Well, I'll check that out.
Yeah, and
Sure.
look up Rivers of Nile as well. I think I know that they're fans of you, so...
Oh, right on.
Yeah.
Right on.
So before we go, I want to thank you so much for your time today. I really enjoyed this conversation. Is there just anything else with the release of Arc of Life that you would like to promote, like maybe a live stream performance to hold people over while we wait for live music, or maybe can you see yourself bringing like Arc of Life on the road for a tour when music returns?
I think the idea is definitely to get on the road and get going. We've got TKO, our agency, working on the case, and as soon as there's an opportunity to do it safely and soundly, we shall. And I'm not so sure we're going to do a live Zoom type gig. I'd rather wait and just get on the road and do it, old school in that regard, so that the first impressions are actually, you can feel a visceral reaction as opposed to some Orwellian television broadcast.
And I feel bad for bands. Like there's one band I interviewed where like they have a member on like a different continent, and like doing a Zoom session like with those different time zones. It's like so weird watching one guy like shred on the guitar while he's drinking his morning coffee, while another guy's like at night having a beer like at 9 o'clock at night.
I know we have a whole other standard now because of the world we live in with, where it's like, it's all right. He's just got his pajamas on. Don't sweat it.
Right. Watch. That's gonna be the fashion statement of rock and roll in the future.
Right, exactly. Well, I'm ahead of the curve.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. We are here with Billy of Arc of Life. Be sure to check out their self-titled album coming out February 12th. This is Alex from Heavy New York. We will see you next time.